Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is entering its third month, and on Thursday, Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed victory over the southern city of Mariupol. But Ukrainian officials are pushing back, saying their forces in the city are refusing to back down. And this week, President Zelensky had this to say.
The Russian army in this war is writing itself into world history forever as the most barbaric and inhuman army in the world.
And images of mass graves surfacing out of Mariupol echo the atrocities that happened in Bucha. Meanwhile, fighting in the eastern Donbass region is intensifying. President Biden also announced an additional $800 million to help Ukraine's military.
We're in a critical window now of time where they're going to set the stage for the next phase of this war. And the United States and our allies and partners are moving as fast as possible to continue to provide Ukraine the forces that they need, the weapons they need, the equipment they need.
He also announced a new program that will allow U.S. citizens and groups to financially support Ukrainians to resettle in the U.S. Now, joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Dan Balz, chief correspondent for The Washington Post, and with me here in studio, Laura Barrón-López, White House correspondent for Politico, and David Sanger, White House and national security correspondent for The New York Times. Thank you all for being here. Dan, I want to come to you first. How significant is the news out of Mariupol this week, given the overall direction of the war?
Well, I think it's very significant, Yamiche. I mean, it's significant for a variety of reasons, but I think primarily because it does really indicate, in a sense, the desperation of the Ukrainian military, which has fought heroically from the beginning of this war, and the sort of crushing reality of a Russian army which has not performed well, but nonetheless continues to put the squeeze on the Ukrainians. And what they have done in Mariupol in the destruction of that city is symbolic of what this war has looked like and where it may be heading. It's moving into a phase that could be more favorable to the Russian army simply because of the kind of terrain that they will be fighting on and the resources that they have, and the fact that the Ukrainian military will be much farther from its much longer supply lines. And so it comes at a very difficult time. And the atrocities that we have seen that you noted in the top of this program continue to be wrenching for the world. And the question is, how much help can the United States and other allies provide the Ukrainians, and how quickly can they get it there?
Well, Dan, I'm going to actually get to that last question about sort of how much aid we can provide. But first, David, I want to turn to you. What do we know about who's really in control of Mariupol, and why does President Putin think he's winning this war?
Well, for Mariupol, it's clear the Russians have most of the city. There is a group of holdouts in the steel plant, in tunnels underneath it. But they're not in a position right now to go push the Russians anywhere. So if Mariupol hasn't fallen now, it seems likely that it will. The really fascinating thing, though, is that, of course, Putin has retreated from his larger objective of taking the entire country and taking it, he hoped, within 30 days. Now, of course, he's well past that. He's now retreated back to the original objective of the East and the South. And I think that's why you heard President Biden make the case that these next few weeks are really critical for the nature of the war. This part of the war is going to look nothing like what you saw in and around Kyiv. This is broad open spaces. As one of my colleagues put it, it is more like fighting in Kansas than fighting in New York. And that means that it does play, as Dan suggested, to the Russian advantage. But it also means that the president's got to get big artillery out that has a chance to really punch the Russians back in place. And if he can do that, if they can make that work, then the Russians would have been through two big setbacks. And of course, as you said, American intelligence thinks that Putin believes he's winning this war, and they've got to convince him otherwise.
And Laura, Dan sort of teed up this question I want to ask you about how much the White House thinks that they can continue to give support and aid to Ukraine, given that they added an additional $800 million. But of course, David here is also talking about the big artillery. Connect those two ideas.
Yeah, I mean, basically the White House has tried to over this period of time, really give what it is hearing that NATO allies as well as Zelensky is saying that he needs. I mean, they try to very much listen to Ukraine about when do you need supplies and when do you not need them. I mean, this is of course going to be a conversation with Congress, but the president is definitely, the White House says that time and time and again they are trying to supply, whether it's the artillery or whether it's other supplies at the ready as soon as they can.
Yeah. And David, I want to come back to you because you were talking about the fact that the next 4 weeks is going to be critical and that in some ways the White House really feels like they can make inroads here. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's all a question of how quickly they can get this equipment to the Ukrainians, whether the Ukrainians are trained in actually using it. And so we've seen Ukrainians actually taken out of Ukraine to some degree, to Poland, to Britain, to be trained on how to use some NATO weaponry that they haven't seen before. If the Russians can't make good progress here, Yamiche, they are a partly broken force at this point. They're putting back together these combat battalion groups, and in doing so, they're putting together soldiers who haven't fought with each other. They're still getting a lot of questions at home about what happened to the ship that the Ukrainians managed to bring down, the Moskva, and that ship. You know, the Russians have made the argument today they lost only one sailor and there were a number missing. We think it was probably significantly worse than that. So President Putin knows that the word is going to get around in Russia that these casualties that the Russians have taken are much worse than he's let on.
That's so interesting, given the fact that we saw Russia test a nuclear-capable missile this week, Dan. There was also this veiled threat, of course, from President Putin. And the Pentagon, though, the United States, of course, is saying that they knew about this test. They were notified in time. But still, what do you make of the timing of this test, given all that's going on?
I think the timing is an effort on the part of President Putin to remind people that however badly his army has performed in Ukraine, that they are still a nuclear-powered nation, one of the handful around the world. And he has rattled sabers on this from the very beginning. And we know that people are worried about whether the Russians might use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And I think to do this missile test was simply a way of saying, do not forget about how mighty we are, even at a time when you may think we are not as strong as we had intended to be. So I think it was mostly symbolic. I think, in any other moment, they would not have had to do this or needed to do this. Maybe it had been a long-planned test, but in the middle of the war, this was nothing more than simply saying, don't forget about how strong we actually can be.
Yeah. It's an interesting point just to think about sort of the reminder that all of this is involving nuclear powers. I want to turn to a somewhat different subject to talk to you, Laura, about, and that is this new program that President Biden announced, saying that people can sponsor, in the United States, people can sponsor Ukrainians now to help them resettle here in the United States. How does that program, how does it relate to the other asylum programs that we see for other immigrants, and what are you hearing from your sources?
Yeah, so basically it was a really big deal when the president decided just about a month ago that they would be taking in 100,000 Ukrainians. And this program that was announced this week, though, was how they were going to do that, how they were going to expedite that process, which is the humanitarian parole program. It's something that they use for Afghanis that were also coming in. And what it does is it makes it so, as you mentioned at the top of the show, that a U.S. American has to sponsor people that are coming in, and they have to go through background checks. But a lot of refugee resettlement organizations have told me that they really hope that this happens very quickly, that it gets off the ground faster. Part of this is the Biden administration's effort to rebuild the refugee program, which was gutted by the prior administration. Some frustration, though, from these same organizations is that they feel as though, what about other vulnerable populations that have been trying to get into the U.S., whether it's Cameroonians, which recently did get TPS status, but also, people from the Central Triangle. They feel as though there isn't really equity there, and there is frustration that Ukrainians are being treated more favorably than others that are fleeing very dangerous homes.
I've certainly heard that from Haitian activists that I talk to, immigration activists that are wondering, okay, well, why can't Haiti and other countries get this this treatment and these programs? David, I want to come to you for another topic, which is May 9th. Russian Victory Day. What's the significance of that date? But also, what do we expect? What do U.S. Intelligence sources, I should say, what do they expect in the coming weeks as we get closer to that date?
Well, May 9th is the anniversary of when the Soviet Union prevailed over Nazi Germany. And so there's a lot of pressure on the Russian troops before this big celebration, which always comes with a show of military might and parades, and Putin will be out speaking and so forth. There's a really big effort underway to show that there was some form of victory in Ukraine, to have something to claim. Now, whether that is the East, the South, seems unlikely right now that they're going to be able to grab the port city of Odessa. We did hear a mid-level Russian defense official today say that the new objectives included trying to grab part of Moldova, another non-NATO state that's got territory that the Russians have long coveted. It's not clear that Putin will actually make much progress between now and May 9. It is certainly clear inside the Pentagon that they want to make sure he doesn't.
Well, it's certainly a date that we'll be watching and that we'll continue to rely on you to explain to our viewers.